Hello, and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Our topic today is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, which is currently before Congress. We're going to begin by asking Ann to give us an overview of the SAVE Act and what its objectives are and what some of the details are of the SAVE Act. So, Ann, I'm going to hand things over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So the SAVE Act has been passed by the House of Representatives, has not yet passed the Senate or been signed into law. It would change current federal law on voter registration. So it amends the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 to require voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship at the time they register to vote. It would not change existing federal law about whether non-citizens can vote. Federal law already prohibits non-citizen voting, but it would be a change from the current voter registration process. Right now, voter registration requires folks to attest on their application to register to vote that they are a U.S. citizen, and that attestation is subject to penalties of perjury if it's incorrect. But the SAVE Act would require everyone attempting to register to vote to provide documentary proof of citizenship at an election office before they could register to vote. And it's just, I want to note one more thing. I'm talking about the SAVE Act, which is the act that has passed the House. But there's another bill that folks are talking about a lot as well with a similar name that's abbreviated as the Save America Act. And so it's just important to be clear what I'm talking about here.
And well, I guess the first question that I have about this SAVE Act and the variations on it is this: what really is the goal of the SAVE Act? What problem is it purporting to fix, and how does it purport to do that?
So let me describe two different possible answers to that, and then I'm interested to hear what other people say. I mean, I think that it's most often being defended on the basis that it will make our elections more secure by, changing the ability that non-citizens would otherwise have to participate in our elections. But there's also been a fair amount of commentary in response to that defense of the bill that points out that the number of non-citizens who have voted in American elections is vanishingly small, that it is incredibly rare. And I think that the research is actually pretty good to that effect. And we do a lot of things to police our electoral processes and to want to prevent non-citizens from voting. And there are penalties, as Ann mentioned, for people who try to do that anyway. It usually happens in the rare cases when it does happen as a matter of accident or inadvertence, or somebody, doesn't actually read the form properly, but it's pretty small. So that said, then other people start trying to accuse proponents of this measure of wanting to support it as a kind of voter suppression measure, as if it's going to effectuate a partisan advantage that would accrue to one side, to the proponent's side of an election. And I don't know whether that's at all true either, because the way in which it's structured, it's going to make registration especially hard for several different categories of voters. And it could well be that the political effects are going to be at best kind of a wash for the two major parties, or could even disadvantage more conservative, rural, Republican-leaning electorate than the opposite. So that has to then lead me to a third explanation for this, which is that it is simply, and I do say simply deliberately here, a piece of the continuing narrative about the 2020 election having been stolen, and that it serves to continue to lead to keep that claim, which has also been pretty thoroughly debunked, alive by saying it was stolen 2020 because of non-citizen voting, and so we've got to do something about it. So here we're doing something about it. So it fosters that story. That's a long-winded answer to your question, Tony. What do others think?
I think, Steve, your point about it being unclear who it actually affects more, if you know, politically, is something that we need to keep thinking about. I think almost all of our past research and past assumptions about which kinds of things turn more people out or suppress this group or that group, I think those are all kind of out the window now since 2020's election. And so I think predicting or thinking you can predict who is going to be most advantaged or disadvantaged by any of an array of kinds of changes to how we vote is kind of almost a fool's errand to think you can know what it's going to actually do.
I should be clear, I do see the SAVE Act as a kind of vote suppressing measure. That is to say, if it were to become enacted into law, that it would have a fairly, significant effect on reducing who can vote. But I just don't know whose ox is going to be gored by that. But it would reduce people's ability to vote, which is, in my view, not a good thing.
So should we say more about how it reduces people's ability to vote?
Yeah, absolutely, Terri.
Yeah, somebody, not me, could say.
I think the big, thing that a lot of folks are talking about is this documentary proof of citizenship requirement, that to register to vote, you would have to display documentary proof of citizenship at an election office. And that list includes documents that show you are a U.S. citizen. So a valid U.S. passport, a valid federal, state, or tribal photo ID that shows you were either born in the U.S. or are a U.S. citizen, or a valid photo ID accompanied by your certified birth record. So that's documentary proof requirement means that a lot of folks who don't, for instance, have passports aren't going to have one handy document that demonstrates that they are U.S. citizens. So you might have to show a valid photo ID plus a birth certificate. But for folks, for instance, who changed their name, maybe after getting married, they might not have a photo ID and a birth certificate that match in terms of their current name. So that makes just that proving that documentary proof of citizenship, that makes it harder for some, might make it harder for some folks to register.
And on that point, what will people have to do if you change your name after getting married and you have a driver's license that doesn't match your birth certificate? What remedy do you have? What can you do to produce sufficient documentary evidence to be allowed to register to vote?
Yeah, so you could bring, additional documentation, but that might include a marriage certificate or something like that. And these are documents that, folks may not just have handy, as opposed to, being at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and signing under penalty of perjury that you're a citizenship. Tracking down that paperwork can be more challenging.
Yeah, I've read numbers that are in the 21 million people. Not that they don't have those documents, but that they don't have easy access to those documents. And I think about college students who left their birth certificate at home or, haven't gotten a passport. And I believe most states' real ID driver's licenses do not indicate citizenship affirmatively. So even though, I think, well, I took all that paperwork to the BMV, I've just proven it, but my license does not say that. So that's not sufficient, right?
I think there's only 5 states right now that have a form of the real ID that actually shows citizenship. Ohio is not one of them.
Right. Isn't that interesting? And I wonder what this means then for election offices in terms of just the mechanics of this. And I also wonder what the impact would be in same-day registration states when you're trying to do two things: confirm this person's citizenship at the time of registration, and also make sure they're at the right precinct and that they're where they're supposed to be to cast a valid ballot. What is that going to look like if this bill does in fact become an act?
I don't know the answer to that. It does lead me to think about whether, if this bill were enacted, it might be the kind of camel's nose under the tent, because then I can see the kind of issue you just talked about, Tony, becoming a basis to want to further federalize things and prohibit same-day registration, for instance, down the road.
And my understanding is that none of the versions of the SAVE Act have funding as part of what comes with it. So we're talking about extra work for people without any kind of financial support for how they're going to do that extra work.
And I wonder if it'll have an impact on the recruiting of volunteers for the election process, that we're so dependent on, oftentimes, the senior citizens who volunteer their time. This feels like it would really significantly increase the burden on them, as well as on the full-time election officials.
There's another dimension of that issue that I worry about too, which is, I believe, the version of the SAVE Act that has passed the House allows private citizens to sue their election workers. That's, I think, problematic. Election workers are under attack already since the 2020 election, so much so that they've had to find ways to find legal representation to respond to various unfounded claims, but they still have to be responded to. This is a new era for election workers. And many election workers are already stretched pretty thin. We're seeing an exodus. I don't have good data. This is anecdotal, but my worry is that we're seeing the field start to be threatened in ways that is counterproductive. I mean, truly, this will make our elections worse. And the notion that private citizens could bring lawsuits just is not a sensible way to try to make our election ecosystems healthier.
But the bill that's passed the House, Steve, would do exactly that. It allows private citizens to sue an election official who registers someone to vote without documentary proof of citizenship, and it creates some criminal penalties for registering someone to vote who does not present documentary proof of citizenship. And so I wonder, I mean, no one has any interest, right, in election officials registering non-eligible voters to vote, but if there is considerable confusion for an election worker about whether particular proof is sufficient documentary proof of citizenship, you know, those penalties make it more likely that they'll err on the side of refusing to register somebody to vote.
Yeah, I just think about the educational task for all of the poll workers. You know, what's required, what kind of documents suffice, when do they have to show them? You know, if we're talking about need to show documentary proof at registration, but now we're also getting into on voting day. If you didn't, what do you need to bring to stay eligible, etc.? And that seems like a huge educational task for people who, as we've just said, are volunteers, and they're only volunteering, let's say at most for the primary and then a general each year. And that's a lot to get up to speed.
And that would be an especially difficult problem or circumstance if the additional provisions of the Save America Act were to become law, which is, I have seen the recent versions of the Save America Act. It imposes some additional ID requirements on voting rather than just citizenship requirements on registration. And that version is still sitting before a committee in the House. But here too, is this the camel's nose? And that's what will come out next if the more bare bones Save Act were to become law. But maybe, is it worth just taking a minute to talk about the prospects of the Save Act actually getting through the Senate, which is where it sits today?
I think so, Steve. Yeah, if we're handicapping the odds, what do we think the odds are that this actually becomes federal law?
We should say we're recording on Wednesday, April 1st. So
good point, Ann.
Something
Very
happens
good
quickly.
point.
Yeah.
Well, so it's not going to pass the Senate unless the Senate changes the filibuster rule. And there have been, serious but not very promising conversations about changing the filibuster rule for election laws specifically, or changing the filibuster rule entirely, getting rid of it entirely. And I say not very promising in the sense that my sense is there is not sufficient support to change the filibuster rule. The filibuster rule in the US Senate today requires 60 of the 100 members to agree to a measure before they can actually then move it to the floor for consideration. The Senate could change the filibuster rule by a bare majority. They only need 51 members of the Senate to change the rule. But they don't have 51 members prepared to change the rule. It's a long-standing part of the Senate's process, and there are, the partisan angle here is the SAVE Act is a Republican measure that President Trump wants to sign, and the Republicans control the Senate, but not by enough. I mean, they've got a bare majority, but there are some Republican senators who've said, I'm never going to vote to do away with the filibuster. So as long as those positions stay fixed, the prospects are zero. The question really is there a realistic chance that 50 Republicans, and then with a tie being broken by the vice president, might vote to scrap the filibuster for this measure? I think that's a long shot. I continue to see those chances as pretty small. What do others think?
I tend to agree with your analysis there, Steve, and I'm kind of I think that we would be very unlikely to see the Senate scrap the filibuster, for election-related matters or in general in this context. I think for the reasons you described.
And it does seem to be a kind of politicking measure that it's even being debated on the Senate floor, or on and off a little bit now, because the prospects of it actually passing the Senate are so small. But the Senate leadership have wanted to put it on record and see how the debate goes. The argument being that it might embarrass the Democrats to be opposed to something so sensible as requiring documentary proof of citizenship when you vote. But I'm not at all sure that those political calculations are very accurate. I mean, I think that Democrats can make a counter argument that this SAVE Act is a vote suppressing measure that is going to make it so much harder for a host of different types of voters, especially perhaps recently married women who are moving and need to re-register, kind of thing. So I'm not sure the political impacts of the Senate debate are very clear either.
Yeah, I agree. And I think at a certain level, the Republican Senate majority has to understand the risks for their own voters if this were to become law. When there was just an Axios piece a few days ago, an analysis that found that 5 million voters mostly in Republican majority counties, and mostly in the Rocky Mountain West, live an hour or more away from their election offices. And so that's a significant number of likely Republican voters who would be burdened by this, as well as Republicans in other parts of the country, that would make this, in my mind, just from a policy standpoint, such a risky policy for the congressional Republican majority to adopt.
Well, and I would think that would also change the political value of having the debate too, that there might be people who would realize, despite the Republican arguments that this is a good measure for making sure our elections are safeguarded, that some of their own voters might be a little bit nervous about what this means and not be supportive of it.
Tony, you want to clarify why the hour or more drive matters?
Right, Terry. The hour drive matters because under the current system, voters don't have to drive to their local election office to register. They can register online or they can register by mail. And for voters who are currently registered but have a change in address, they would, in the past, where it would be a fairly easy process to update their registration, they now would be forced to drive to that election office to produce documentary proof of citizenship. The other interesting thing about this is this bill, which the Republicans are promoting in Congress, is coming on the heels of two really good elections for the Republican Party in terms of the popular vote. Both in 2024, President Trump won a majority, over 1 million votes more than his Democratic opponent. I guess it wasn't a sheer majority, but it was a plurality of the vote that he won. And the House Republicans, if you tabulate or add up all the votes for House Republican candidates versus House Democratic candidates in 2024, the Republicans won by a significant margin. I think this is off the top of my head, but something like 3 or 4 million votes was the Republican margin. In the 2022 midterms as well, the Republicans got more votes than the Democrats did in U.S. House elections. So it's interesting that at a time when the Republicans have gotten a pretty significant amount of popular momentum, the congressional Republicans are considering a policy that could end up being self-defeating for them.
Well, that reminds me too of a different issue. It's not particularly SAVE Act, but it's certainly timely today, April 1st, because yesterday, March 31st, the president issued an executive order on mail-in balloting. And there too, it's not at all clear what the actual impact of restricting mail-in voting might be. And of course, here we've got a different legal question. With respect to the SAVE Act, the question we were talking about is it going to become law? With respect to the executive order, it is an executive order. Now the question is it a lawful executive order? Does the president have the authority that he was purporting to use? And we're absolutely sure there will be litigation contesting the validity of this executive order. But were it to be actually implemented according to its terms, what the impact would be on voters is, I think, hard to predict too, in similar ways.
And one of the questions I have about the executive order, if it were to be upheld by the courts, is what would this mean for the U.S. Postal Service? Because it appears to be putting just an incredible burden on the Postal Service when doing its job in delivering the mail, to elections offices. The Postal Service now would have new duties to inspect that mail, to just, at least as I understand the way that the executive order is drafted, that the Postal Service would be playing a role here in protecting the integrity of the mail as a medium for transmitting federal election ballots. And Terri had made this point earlier. The SAVE Act doesn't provide any additional funding for elections offices around the country, and certainly doesn't appear to me that this executive order provides any additional funding for the U.S. Postal Service.
Yeah, I'd wondered a little bit about the Postal Service's role in implementing this executive order too. I mean, I have really no doubt that Congress could charge the Postal Service with this type of role and being in charge of supervising the way in which mail-in ballots are delivered. But I don't believe that kind of congressional authorization or direction to the Postal Service exists right now. So I was thinking of it really from the legality standpoint too. Does the president have the ability to supervise the particulars of the Postal Service this way? I don't know the answer to that, but it was a separate legal question for me.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either, Steve. And of course, the Elections Clause itself in Article 1 of the Constitution gives the power to regulate federal elections, first to the states and then to the Congress. But there's no mention of the president there in the Elections Clause itself. And it's housed in Article 1, which, of course, is what establishes the Congress.
You know, another question that I know maybe we've talked about ourselves at other times past, and other listeners may have wondered about, is if the SAVE Act did become law, what impact would it have on state and local elections? This comes back to the point you just made, Tony, about how with respect to federal elections, the Constitution provides that states, in the first instance, are responsible for determining how to conduct elections for federal offices. And then the Constitution doesn't itself speak directly to what states do when they conduct elections for just their local and statewide races rather than federal races. And so there are plenty of states today that conduct state and local elections on a different timetable than federal elections, for instance, and in other respects have chosen to do things differently. And so the SAVE Act, by its terms, would only apply to federal elections. But to answer my own question, and then you can tell me what you all think about this, I'm sure a lot of states, if the SAVE Act were to become law, would want to piggyback on what they're already having to do for federal elections, for state elections, even if they didn't have to do that. It would be administratively more efficient for them. But I don't know how widespread that would be, and it might be that there would be some states who would say, notwithstanding the efficiency, we're not going to demand proof of citizenship for our voters to register for local elections, or is that just going to be too much of a bifurcated process for states? What do you people think?
Well, don't we already have one state that's kind of running in a bifurcated process? I think I think Arizona is already running two separate election systems because they did require a citizenship requirement like 20 years ago. That was challenged in court. So on federal grounds, so their federal elections are run. Some people who have not proven citizenship can only vote in federal elections in Arizona because the state does require, I believe is how it goes. Anyway, you can see the complexity of two different systems, who gets which ballots, whose votes are legitimate for which level of election, becomes yet another nightmare for elections officials. I don't know how Arizona is managing it, but I do know they have a dual system like that.
And some states already allow non-citizens to vote in local elections, right, as well. So we have some experience with different systems, but it seems like there would be a strong incentive if this legislation is enacted for states that already pair state, local, and federal elections to just apply the same federal requirements for efficiency's sake.
As you observed at the outset, Ann, we already have a federal law that says for purposes of federal elections, only U.S. citizens are eligible to vote.
Right.
And that's been the law for about 30 years now, almost, I think. But there's no necessary reason that that's the way the electorate is structured. And you can imagine why in certain local races for school board or whatever, when you have lawful permanent residents who may not be citizens, but they're regular members of the community, they're in the United States full time, they have kids going to the schools, that they're allowed to vote in their school board elections, for instance, right?
Right.
It's just a policy choice about what the electorate will be.
Well, I think this entire discussion underscores how complex American election law is. Not that it's not complex in other parts of the world, but I doubt there's any country who has an election system more complex than the United States. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to thank Ann and Steve and Terri for another fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank our viewers and our listeners for tuning in to Law and Democracy, which, as I said at the top, is a podcast of the election law program at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode, which will appear on YouTube and Apple Podcasts, as always. Thank you very much, everyone.